The echoes of desolation. The space station drifted in the cold abyss, a forsaken relic swallowed by darkness. It had once been a thriving outpost, bustling with trade and interstellar negotiations. Now it was nothing more than a tomb, silent, broken, and abandoned. In the shadows of a dimly lit maintenance bay, a young Noran girl named Mela huddled behind a pile of shattered crates. Her small frame trembled as she wrapped her arms around her knees, her lavender skin shimmering faintly under the flickering emergency lights. Her large violet eyes darted toward every sound, every movement in the distance. She had never felt this kind of fear before, not when her people whispered about the dangers of deep space, not even when the alarms blared in morning. This was worse. She had been left behind. Her people had fled the moment the attack began, scrambling to their escape pods in blind desperation. The pirates had come like a plague, spreading death and destruction through the halls. Mela's parents were among the diplomats stationed here, but when the alarms had shrieked, they had been separated in the chaos. She had tried to follow, but the crowd had been too thick, the fear too overwhelming. By the time she had reached the docking bay, it was too late. The escape ships had already launched, their thrusters burning bright as they vanished into the void. No one had waited. No one had looked back. She had pounded on the locked hangar doors, screaming for them to return. But the only answer was silence. Now, the station belonged to the monsters. Her breath hitched as she listened to the distant, guttural snarls that echoed through the air ducts. Something had made its home here. Something hungry, something hunting. The pirates might have left after looting what they could, but another predator had taken their place. She tried to steady her breathing, but every instinct screamed at her to run. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Unrelenting. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't the creature. This was something else. The stories of her people came rushing back, filling her mind with terror. Humans. Carnivorous, brutal, and lawless. The civilized races called them the butchers of the void. The elders whispered about their savage nature, the way they tore through enemies, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. And now one was coming for her. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her body rigid as the heavy boots drew closer. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint light. The armor was worn and battle-scarred, plates of reinforced alloy covering broad shoulders. A massive rifle was slung across his chest, the muzzle slightly lowered but still within reach. His face was lined with experience, his eyes cold and sharp. Mela clenched her fists. This was it. The monster had found her. The human tilted his head, scanning the room with careful precision. His gaze landed on her trembling form, and for a split second, they locked eyes. Mela sucked in a sharp breath. She expected him to lunge, to bare his fangs and strike. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow step forward and lowered his weapon. "Hey there." His voice was deep and rough, but not unkind. "You alone, kid." Mela flinched, pressing herself harder against the crates. The words were foreign, unintelligible. But his tone, it wasn't what she expected. Still, she knew better than to trust it. She had seen what happened to those who trusted the wrong people. The station creaked around them, the sound of metal groaning under unseen pressure. The distant snarls grew louder. Michael Hayes, former soldier, now a mercenary scraping by on high-risk salvage jobs, assessed the situation quickly. He had come to this abandoned station expecting the simple retrieval mission. Maybe some spare tech, leftover supplies, or a long-forgotten stash of credits. He had not expected this. A terrified alien girl. A Noran. And something else lurking in the station. Michael's instincts screamed at him to leave her. She wasn't his problem. His job was salvage, not babysitting. If she had been left behind, there was probably a reason for it. But damn it all, he had never been the kind of man to leave a kid to die. His grip tightened on his rifle as the snarls turned into a low guttural growl. The thing was getting closer. "We don't have time for this," he muttered, mostly to himself. The alien girl shrank further into the crates, her fear radiating off her in waves. She didn't understand him. That was a problem. Michael exhaled sharply before kneeling down, making himself seem smaller. He slowly extended a gloved hand, keeping his movements deliberate. She recoiled. He cursed under his breath. There was no time for this. The growling was now accompanied by the heavy thud of claws against metal. It was coming. Michael's patience snapped. All right, kid. No time to argue. In one swift motion, he grabbed her. Mela let out a strangled yelp, her tiny fists hammering against his armor, but he barely felt it. He hoisted her into his arms and turned on his heel, sprinting down the corridor. Behind them, something roared. The hunt had begun. Michael didn't look back. He focused on running, his boots pounding against the cold steel floor. The girl clung to him now, whether from terror or instinct, he didn't know. Up ahead, he spotted an old blast door. It was partially open, the rusted edges jammed from years of disrepair. He shoved himself through, twisting his body to squeeze them both inside. The door groaned as it gave way slightly, just enough to seal behind them with a metallic screech. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the beast slammed against the door. The impact sent a tremor through the corridor, dust falling from the ceiling. Michael gritted his teeth. That thing was strong. Too strong. He turned to the girl, still trembling in his arms. Her violet eyes were wide with confusion and fear. Michael sighed, adjusting his grip so she wasn't dangling awkwardly. "Well, kid," he muttered, "looks like we're stuck together." Another slam rattled the door. Michael exhaled, eyes scanning for an escape route. This was going to be one hell of a night. The hunter in the dark. The old blast door shuddered again, the metal creaking under the force of another devastating impact. The creature on the other side wasn't giving up. Michael could hear its guttural breathing, low and menacing, as its claws scraped against the steel. The sound sent a chill down his spine. The station was a tomb, and they were trapped inside it. Michael adjusted his grip on the tiny Noran girl, who had gone completely stiff in his arms. Her large violet eyes were locked on the shaking door, her small fingers digging into the fabric of his armor. Another impact. Another dent in the reinforced metal. Damn it. Michael shifted the girl to the ground, gently but firmly. "All right, kid," he muttered, looking around for an escape route. "I don't know if you can understand me, but we need to move." She didn't respond, didn't even blink. She was frozen in place, her breathing shallow and erratic. Michael sighed. He had seen this kind of fear before, back when he served in the Terran military. People caught in war zones, frozen by sheer terror. He had learned that sometimes words didn't work. Action did. He crouched down to her level, lowering his voice. "Listen, I know you're scared, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Still no response. Michael rubbed his temples. Great, just great. The creature roared, slamming against the door with renewed force. The steel groaned, the hinges barely holding. No time. Michael scanned the room. The dim emergency lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Worn-out control panels lined the edges of the space, most of them cracked or malfunctioning. But at the far end of the corridor, partially hidden behind debris, was another door. A way out. Michael pulled the girl's arm, urging her to move. "Come on, we can't stay here." She finally reacted, just barely. Her gaze flickered to his hand on her arm, then back to his face. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Michael sighed and did what he always did in situations like this. He took control. Without waiting, he scooped her up again and sprinted toward the exit. Behind them, the blast door finally gave in. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the corridor. Metal groaned and screeched as the door was ripped apart. A monstrous figure loomed in the wreckage, its silhouette illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall. Its body was a grotesque fusion of muscle and armor-like plating, its limbs unnaturally elongated. Its jagged teeth gleamed as it let out a hungry, bone-chilling snarl. Michael didn't look back. His instincts screamed ruin. The girl clung to him, burying her face into his chest as he charged toward the far door. His breath came in sharp bursts, his muscles screaming in protest. The weight of his armor, the rifle slung across his back, the child in his arms, it all slowed him down. But he pushed forward. He reached the door and slammed his palm against the control panel. Nothing. A dead screen. No power. Damn it. The creature let out a guttural snarl, its claws clicking against the metal floor as it prowled closer. Michael didn't have to turn around to know it was nearly on top of them. With no other choice, he drew his pulse rifle and spun around. The creature lunged. Michael fired. The first round struck its armored shoulder, the energy blast sending a brief flicker of blue light across the dark corridor. The impact barely slowed it down. The second shot hit its leg, forcing it to stagger, but it recovered quickly. Michael cursed under his breath. Of course, it's built like a damn tank. The monster roared and swung. Michael barely dodged in time. The sheer force of the strike shattered the panel beside him, sparks flying. The girl let out a tiny whimper, gripping his armor even tighter. Michael fired 3 more shots, aiming for the joints. This time, the beast reeled back, letting out a pained snarl. It wasn't dead, but it was wounded. That was all the opening he needed. He turned and grabbed the manual override lever beside the door. It was rusted, stiff, but he put all his strength into it. The door slid open just enough. Michael squeezed through, dragging the girl with him, then slammed the lever back down. The door shut with a loud clang. Silence. Michael exhaled, pressing his back against the wall. He could still hear the creature snarling on the other side, claws raking against the steel, but it couldn't reach them. Not yet. He turned to the girl, who was staring at him now, not in terror, but in shock. She had seen something. Michael frowned. What? She hesitated before reaching toward his arm. Her tiny fingers brushed against his shoulder, right where the creature's claw had grazed him. Pain flared. Michael hissed, looking down. His armor had been torn open. Blood seeped from the wound, staining the metal. Damn it. But it wasn't the injury that concerned him. It was the look on her face. Something about that wound meant something to her. She whispered something in her language, soft, almost like a prayer. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time since he had found her, there was understanding. Michael exhaled. He had no idea what the hell was going on. But right now, one thing was clear. They had bigger problems. Because the station wasn't just abandoned. It was a hunting ground. And they weren't alone. The hunting grounds. The sound of claws raking against metal echoed through the corridor, sending another wave of tension through Michael's body. He knew the door wouldn't hold forever. The creature on the other side was relentless, and judging by the damage it had already caused, it wouldn't take long before it found another way in. He exhaled sharply, forcing his mind to focus. First priority. Find another way out. The girl, Mela, as he'd heard her whisper earlier, was still clutching his armor, her small hands trembling against the cold metal. But there was something in her eyes now. Not just fear. Recognition. Michael wasn't sure what she had seen when she touched his wound, but whatever it was, it had shaken her. He didn't have time to think about it. They had to move. His eyes swept the new hallway they had entered. Unlike the crumbling corridors of the outer station, this section still had partial power. A faint blue glow illuminated the walls. Flickering control panels lined the edges, and a dim emergency light pulsed ahead. There, Michael spotted what looked like an old access shaft, the kind engineers used to move between maintenance levels. If they could get to the station's lower decks, maybe they could find another escape pod, or at least a more defensible position. He moved quickly, gripping his pulse rifle with one hand while guiding Mela forward with the other. The girl followed without resistance, though she kept looking back toward the sealed door, her expression troubled. Michael wasn't sure why, but he had the distinct feeling she knew something he didn't. They reached the shaft, and Michael was relieved to see the manual ladder still intact. He gave the bars a quick tug, sturdy enough. He turned to Mela. "All right, kid. We're going down." She blinked at him, not understanding the words, but when he pointed to the ladder, her eyes widened. A sharp bang rang through the corridor. Michael stiffened. The door. A second bang. This time, metal groaned. The creature was testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. Michael didn't wait to see how long it would take. He grabbed Mela and placed her onto the ladder, motioning for her to climb down. She hesitated, glancing between him and the approaching threat, but then nodded and started descending. Smart kid. Michael slung his rifle over his shoulder and followed after her. The shaft was tight, barely wide enough to accommodate his armor, but he made quick work of the descent. The further they climbed, the colder it became. By the time they reached the lower deck, their breath was visible in the frigid air. Michael landed on the grated floor and immediately pulled Mela away from the shaft. The last thing they needed was that thing dropping in on them. The room they had entered was vast, lined with rows of cryostasis chambers. Some were cracked, their glass frosted over from years of neglect. Others flickered weakly, their internal systems struggling to maintain whatever was inside. Michael frowned. What the hell is this place? Mela, however, seemed to recognize it. She stepped forward, placing a hand against one of the working chambers. Her fingers traced the ice-covered surface, her lips moving in a silent murmur. Michael watched her carefully. "You know what's in these things, don't you?" She turned to him. Her eyes flickered with hesitation before she slowly reached into the folds of her clothing, pulling out a small device. It was sleek, metallic, and pulsing with a soft golden light. Michael narrowed his eyes. "What is that?" Mela hesitated for only a second before pressing the device against the chamber. The ice on the glass melted instantly. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Inside the pod was a Noran, a full-grown male, clad in the elaborate robes of nobility. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths, his face frozen in a peaceful slumber. Michael took a step back. This was a prison. Mela turned back to him, her expression conflicted. The realization clicked into place. This station wasn't just abandoned. It was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had just woken up. Secrets in the ice. A deep hum vibrated through the chamber as the frost-covered pod slowly unsealed itself. Mist hissed from the edges, filling the air with a biting chill. Michael instinctively raised his rifle, stepping in front of Mela as the pod's glass lid lifted open. Inside, the slumbering Noran took his first breath in who knew how long. Michael's muscles tensed. He had no idea whether this was a friend or an enemy, but from the way Mela had approached the chamber, this was not a coincidence. The Noran's eyes snapped open, pale and glowing in the dim light. Michael took a step back, finger twitching near the trigger. The figure inside the pod gasped, sitting up abruptly. His body trembled from the sudden exposure to the cold air, but his gaze immediately locked onto Mela. He whispered something in their alien tongue, his voice hoarse. Mela's face lit up with recognition as she rushed toward him, speaking rapidly in return. Michael barely caught his balance as the two embraced. They knew each other. Michael frowned, lowering his weapon but keeping his stance firm. He watched as the older Noran cupped Mela's face, scanning her as if checking for injuries. His expression shifted from relief to alarm as she frantically explained something. Michael exhaled sharply. "All right, someone mind telling me what the hell is going on?" The older Noran's head snapped up at the sound of Michael's voice. His entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His expression darkened, his muscles tensed, and his eyes filled with deep, burning hatred. The next second, he lunged. Michael barely had time to react before the alien's hand shot out, gripping his throat and slamming him against the pod's frame. His back crashed against the metal, knocking the air from his lungs. The Noran was fast, too fast for someone who had just woken up from cryosleep. Mela shouted in alarm, grabbing the older Noran's arm in protest, but the alien wasn't letting go. His grip was ironclad, pressing against Michael's windpipe. Michael's instincts kicked in. He raised his rifle, shoving the barrel against the Noran's sternum. "I don't want to kill you," he rasped through clenched teeth. "But I will." The Noran's eyes flashed with something unreadable. His grip didn't loosen. Mela frantically spoke in her native tongue, tugging on the older alien's arm. Her voice grew desperate, pleading. Finally, after a tense moment, the Noran released Michael. Michael stumbled forward, coughing as he rubbed his throat. His pulse hammered in his ears. "Dan," he muttered, glaring at the older alien. "That's one hell of a greeting." The Noran snarled something in response, his voice laced with venom. He gestured at Michael, then looked at Mela, as if demanding an explanation. Mela stepped between them, shaking her head vehemently. She pointed at Michael, then at herself, then mind running, a crude but effective way of explaining what had happened. The older Noran's brow furrowed. His breathing was still heavy, his posture rigid with tension, but he was listening. Mela reached out, placing a hand on his chest, her expression soft. Something in the older Noran's face shifted. His gaze flickered between Michael and the girl before his shoulders dropped slightly. Michael exhaled, loosening his grip on his rifle. "So, you're her family, huh?" He studied the older alien carefully. "I take it you don't like humans much." The Noran didn't respond, but the glare he shot Michael was enough of an answer. Mela spoke again, this time more gently, as if reassuring him. Slowly, the tension in the air thinned. Michael ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but standing around arguing isn't gonna help us. We've got a bigger issue right now." The Noran's eyes narrowed. Michael jerked his thumb toward the ceiling. "Something big is hunting us, and that door won't hold it forever." The Noran stiffened. His gaze snapped upward, as if suddenly aware of the distant clanking and growling reverberating through the station. Then, for the first time, Michael saw something other than hostility in his expression. He saw understanding. The Noran cursed in his own language, then turned to one of the broken control panels nearby. He slammed his palm against it, and to Michael's surprise, the console flickered to life. Michael raised a brow. "You got this place wired." The Noran ignored him, his fingers moving swiftly over the ancient interface. More pods activated, their screens blinking as the system powered up. Michael's eyes widened. One pod was one thing, but now dozens were starting to wake. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a prison. This was a tomb full of warriors. And now, they were waking up. Awakening the warriors. The hum of awakening cryo chambers vibrated through the frozen air, filling the room with an eerie rhythmic pulse. One by one, the pods flickered to life, frost peeling away as the ancient warriors within began to stir. Michael's grip tightened on his rifle. He knew a battlefield when he saw one. And this was a graveyard waking up. Mela clung to the older Noran, her violet eyes darting between the pods and Michael. She looked hopeful, relieved even, but Michael wasn't so sure relief was the right emotion to have right now. The Noran male, the one who had nearly crushed his throat a minute ago, was focused on the controls, his fingers moving swiftly across the terminal. He barked something in his native tongue, his voice sharp, authoritative. Michael exhaled. "Okay, I may not speak your language, but I can tell when someone's giving orders." Mela turned to him, her expression hesitant. She pointed to the pods, then tapped her chest, then pointed to the older Noran. "Family." Michael processed that quickly. These weren't just any warriors. They were likely Mela's people, soldiers, guards, maybe even exiled royalty. That would explain why she had been targeted, why the station had been left to rot. But that still didn't explain what the hell had been hunting them. A deep, bone-rattling growl vibrated through the metal walls. Michael's instincts screamed move. The Noran male stiffened, his eyes flickering toward the ceiling. Even Mela flinched. They all knew what that sound meant. Michael cursed under his breath. It's coming. Before anyone could react, the station lurched. The force of the impact rattled the walls, shaking loose old wiring and sending a gust of frigid air through the room. A shriek of twisting metal echoed above them, followed by the distinct clang of something massive moving through the vents. Michael took a slow, controlled breath. "Tell me one of you has a plan." The Noran male, to his surprise, didn't hesitate. He reached into a compartment on the control panel and yanked out a small energy blade, its violet glow casting long shadows against his face. He tossed it to Michael. Michael caught it instinctively, the weapon humming in his grip. He raised a brow. "Oh, so now we're sharing." The Noran ignored him, turning to Mela and speaking quickly in his language. She nodded, her little hands gripping onto his robe as if absorbing every word. Michael had no idea what was being said, but he could tell one thing. The plan involved running. The first pod fully unsealed with a loud hiss. Inside, a warrior, a towering Noran female clad in sleek, frost-covered armor, opened her eyes. Her muscles tensed as she sat up, her gaze sharp and immediately assessing the situation. Michael didn't have time to admire the efficiency, because at that exact moment, the ceiling collapsed. A monstrous figure dropped from the vents, its form shrouded in darkness and mist. Michael barely had time to register its full shape before it let out a horrific, guttural snarl and lunged. Michael reacted on instinct. He rolled, pulling Mela with him as the creature's claws ripped into the floor where they had just been standing. Sparks flew, metal shrieked, and the force of the impact sent a shockwave through the entire chamber. The Noran warrior who had just awoken wasted no time. She moved like a trained soldier, activating an energy shield from her wrist and throwing herself between the creature and Mela. Michael scrambled back to his feet, his rifle raised, and for the first time, he saw the beast up close. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its elongated limbs covered in bone-plated armor. Its eyes burned with a crimson glow, its maw lined with serrated teeth. But it wasn't just its size that made Michael's stomach drop. It was the scars. This thing had been experimented on, modified, enhanced, and judging by the sheer hatred in its gaze, it had been bred for one purpose: to kill. The Noran warrior shouted something, raising her shield just as the creature lunged again. Michael fired. The pulse rifle's blast struck the beast's side, but it barely flinched. Instead, it twisted unnaturally fast, claws slicing through the air as it came for him. Michael had no choice. He activated the energy blade. The weapon hummed to life, casting a violet glow across the battlefield. Michael barely had time to dodge to the left before the creature's claws slammed down where he had just been. The floor cracked under the impact. Michael grit his teeth. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." The Noran warrior moved in tandem, striking at the creature's exposed flank. Her energy shield clashed against its armored hide, sending sparks flying. Mela screamed. Michael's heart nearly stopped. He spun, just in time to see a second creature emerging from the darkness. It had been waiting. Michael's stomach plummeted. There wasn't just one. There were more. And now, they were surrounded. The Noran warrior let out a battle cry, the others in the still opening pods beginning to stir. Michael adjusted his grip on the energy blade. His mind was racing, but his body already knew what to do. He met Mela's terrified gaze and gave her the only reassurance he could. "Don't worry, kid," he muttered. Then he turned back to the creatures. "I've been fighting monsters my whole life." The last stand. The creatures moved in eerie synchronization, their bone-plated limbs clicking against the frozen steel floor as they surrounded Michael, Mela, and the awakening Noran warriors. Their crimson eyes burned with an unnatural hunger, their bodies twisting and shifting like predators that had evolved beyond the need for mercy. Michael's grip on the energy blade tightened. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his mind was razor sharp. He had been here before. Outnumbered. Hunted. The only way out. Fight like hell. The first creature lunged. Michael moved instantly, sidestepping the attack and slashing with the energy blade. The weapon sliced cleanly through the beast's forearm, severing it with a hiss of burnt flesh. The creature let out a distorted screech, but it didn't fall. Instead, it twisted unnaturally, using its remaining arm to swipe at his legs. Michael barely had time to jump back, the claw skimming past his armor, leaving deep gashes across his shin. He clenched his teeth. Damn, these things were fast. A second creature charged from the left. Before Michael could react, the Noran warrior intercepted it. The female soldier moved with terrifying precision, raising her energy shield and slamming it into the creature's face. The impact sent it stumbling back, just long enough for her to activate a long plasma spear and drive it deep into the beast's chest. The creature let out a strangled snarl, its body twitching violently before going still. One down. Michael exhaled sharply. At least they could die. More pods were opening now. More Noran warriors were waking up. Their armor still glistened with frost, but they moved like seasoned soldiers, quickly assessing the battlefield. The older Noran, the one who had tried to kill Michael earlier, was already issuing commands. His voice was firm, commanding, and the warriors responded with immediate discipline. They weren't just soldiers. They were elites. Michael didn't have time to be impressed, because the third creature was already on him. It lunged, its claw raking toward his throat. Michael reacted purely on instinct. He ducked, rolled, and came up swinging. The energy blade cleaved into its side, cutting through the plated exoskeleton, but it wasn't deep enough. The creature whipped around, its tail smashing into Michael's chest. The impact sent him flying backward. He crashed into a rusted support beam, the force rattling his entire body. His rifle clattered to the floor, and his breath came in sharp, painful bursts. Mayla screamed his name. Michael groaned, pushing himself to his feet. Not yet. He wasn't done. The creature sprinted toward him, its eyes glowing like a demon from humanity's worst nightmares. Michael braced himself. Then, a plasma bolt tore through the creature's skull. Michael blinked. The older Noran male had fired the shot. The creature collapsed in a heap, its body convulsing for a second before going still. Michael met the Noran's eyes. The older warrior gave him a slow, measured nod. A truce. For now. Michael exhaled. About time. But there was no relief yet, because the ground shook violently. A deep, resonating roar filled the chamber, so loud it shook Michael's bones. Then the walls cracked. Michael turned just in time to see the largest creature yet emerge from the shadows. 10 feet tall, twice the size of the others. Its body was heavily armored, its claws long enough to slice through reinforced hull plating. And its eyes, burning, intelligent, calculating. Michael's stomach dropped. This wasn't a hunter. This was the Alpha, and it was here to finish the job. The Noran warriors immediately regrouped, their weapons raised, their bodies tense. Michael lifted his rifle, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He stole a glance at Mayla. She was watching him, her small hands clench, her face pale. Michael forced a grin, even as blood dripped from his lip. "Stay behind me, kid," he muttered. Then, as the Alpha let out a deafening roar, Michael charged. The final confrontation. The Alpha beast roared, its monstrous voice shaking the very foundations of the derelict station. The walls trembled, the frost-coated ceiling above them cracking as dust and debris rained down. The Noran warriors stood their ground, forming a defensive line, energy shields flickering to life as they prepared for the inevitable battle. Michael had no shield, no armor reinforcements, Just a rifle, an energy blade, and sheer human stubbornness. But that was enough. He charged. The Alpha lunged forward, its massive frame moving faster than something that size should be able to. Its claws swiped through the air, aimed directly at Michael's head. Michael rolled to the side, barely avoiding the attack as he brought up his pulse rifle and fired 3 rapid shots. The energy blasts hit their mark, burning into the beast's plated hide. But it barely flinched. Michael barely had time to react before the creature's tail swung toward him. Too fast. The impact sent him flying. He crashed against a metal pillar, pain exploding through his ribs as his rifle slipped from his grasp. The wind was knocked out of him, his vision flickering for a split second. Move. 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 Michael's body screamed in protest as he forced himself to roll just before the Alpha's massive claws smashed into the ground where he had been lying. The force shattered the steel floor, sending chunks of metal flying in every direction. Michael pushed himself to his knees, vision swimming. His rifle was too far away. The Alpha loomed over him, eyes glowing with something almost intelligent. It wasn't just going to kill him. It was studying him. Michael gritted his teeth. Yeah, take a good look, ugly. Then he activated his energy blade. The violet blade flashed to life, crackling with raw power. The Alpha snarled, recognizing the weapon as a threat. Before it could attack, the Noran warriors struck. They rushed in from both sides, plasma spears and rifles aimed at the creature's exposed weak points. The first volley of fire struck the Alpha's joints, forcing it to stagger back. The older Noran male barked orders, his blade clashing against the beast's claws as he fought side by side with his warriors. Michael didn't waste the opening. He pushed forward, ducking low, and drove his energy blade straight into the Alpha's ribs. The blade sank deep, cutting through armor and flesh. The Alpha roared, its tail lashing out in agony. Michael had seconds to react. He yanked the blade free and jumped back, just before the beast's tail slammed into the ground where he had been. The floor cracked beneath its strength. The Noran warrior closest to him shouted something. Michael didn't need a translator to understand it. Keep attacking. The warriors pressed forward, coordinating their strikes. The Alpha was slowing down. Its movements became sluggish, its wounds bleeding a thick, inky substance. But it was still standing. Still dangerous. Michael tightened his grip on his blade. He could see it now, the final weak spot. The Alpha's neck plating had cracked. One clean hit, and it would be over. Michael exhaled. He knew what he had to do. He looked at Mela. Her wide violet eyes locked onto him, fear and hope battling in her expression. Michael gave her a small, confident nod. Stay back, kid. Then he ran straight at the Alpha. The creature saw him coming, its eyes narrowing as it let out a final deafening snarl. Michael jumped. The Alpha swung at him midair, but it was too slow. Michael twisted his body, flipping over the creature's massive claw. And then, with every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he drove the energy blade deep into the Alpha's throat. The beast let out a strangled, gurgling roar as the violet energy pierced through its flesh, burning into its spine. Michael twisted the blade. The Alpha convulsed violently, its massive form shuddering. Then it collapsed. The ground shook as the monster hit the floor, motionless. Silence. Michael lay there for a moment, his breathing ragged, his limbs screaming in pain. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up. He looked at the fallen Alpha, then at the Noran warriors, who were staring at him with unreadable expressions. Then, the older Noran stepped forward. Michael tensed. The warrior studied him for a moment, then did something Michael did not expect. He bowed his head, a gesture of respect. Michael blinked. Didn't see that coming. Mela ran forward, throwing her arms around him. Micah. Michael froze for a second, then sighed, patting her head. Yeah. I'm still in one piece, kid. The The warriors murmured amongst themselves, the tension finally breaking. The battle was over. Michael exhaled. His body ached, his mind was spinning, but for the first time since stepping onto this cursed station, he felt alive. The older Noran approached, studying him. Then, in broken English, he said, "You fought well, human." Michael smirked. "Not bad yourself." The warrior's expression remained unreadable. Then, slowly, he extended a hand. A truce. Michael hesitated for only a second, then shook it. Mela smiled. For the first time, she wasn't alone. And for the first time, Michael wasn't just a mercenary. He was part of something bigger. The Noran warriors began securing the room, but Michael just looked up at the stars through the broken ceiling. He wasn't sure where they were going next. But wherever it was, he wasn't going alone.